Thanks, Nick, and thanks to ISAC in New England for supporting and sponsoring these webinars. And thanks for all of you for attending, taking a little bit of time out of your Thursday afternoon, the second week of January already. So as Nick said, I'm Brian Kelly. I'm a virtual CISO here at Compass IT Compliance. I joined Compass back in the summer of 2022. But I was a Compass customer first, one of their first customers actually. I was at Quinnipiac at the time. I was the CISO there for 13 years, Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. Compass did our audit work, our PCI, our HIPAA, our FERPA, red flag, all of that stuff. So I've known Compass for over a decade. Was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to come work with the team here about almost 2 years ago now. Currently, in that role of virtual CISO, I'm supporting clients across multiple verticals, from biopharma to software development, finance, manufacturing, and of course, higher ed. I spent about 16 years in higher ed. After leaving Quinnipiac, I went to work for EduCause, which is a national nonprofit running their cybersecurity program for a couple of years in between Quinnipiac and Compass. And we're here today, as Nick talked about, to discuss third-party risk. All of those clients that I'm supporting we all have third-party risk. And I think what we've seen over the years is numerous examples, dating back to the early 2000s, of where the enterprises have been impacted by third-party, incidents or breaches. More recently, we've seen examples where ransomware, right? Everything is sort of based around ransomware attacks that's in the news. But we've seen, those third parties that have ransomware attacks sort of indirectly impact our enterprises because the services that we've contracted with are interrupted. So we'll talk through some of those things today. We'll talk through some of the ways we can go forward on that. And I'll jump to my next slide, which should give us some objectives around today, around sort of aligning vendor risk assessments to some of our controls, steps that we can take, some examples of policies and services, and then just some timeframes for how we go forward with establishing these reviews. And as Nick had said, it's hard in a webinar to get sort of visual feedback. When you're talking to a room, you can get nods of agreement or people disagreeing. If there's comments, questions, by all means, put them in the chat. Share with each other. I mean, I think when we talk about examples, in a room, you could say show of hands if your company or your business has been impacted by a third party or vendor risk in recent history. Hard to do in a webinar. Don't want to make you all, put in chat that you've been impacted, right? So because it is being recorded, but certainly, opportunities to sort of think about vendor risk and third party risk holistically. Sometimes we'll hear third party risk defined. We love acronyms in this business, so we'll see things like TPRM, third party risk management programs, not to be confused with TPMS, which is that tire pressure monitoring sensor that goes off all the time in the winter, especially on my car, where it tells me I've got to add air to the tires. So just, we call it different things, right? And that's one of the wonderful things about IT and information security and cybersecurity is we have multiple names for things, right? So understanding sort of, you have a program. When I say, what do we call it? What do we name things? We talked about examples of recent breaches, right? I'm always cautious, like what's in a name, and careful what you name your company or application. I think most of us on the call are probably familiar with or have heard of Progress Software. They make a product called Move It. Hopefully you all are aware, but careful what you name your product, right? Move It is exactly what the hackers did almost a year ago, dating back to, I think, early spring of 2023. The hackers used the Move It software to move it, and the it being, tons of data. And I continue to, again, show of hands, how many folks have gotten notification letters at home personally. I continue to get letters from third and fourth parties that I didn't know that I was doing business with, right? So I think that's, an example of sort of a true supply chain issue where we get not only third party or vendor risk issues, but we also have fourth and fifth party risk that comes into that, right? So, in many of these organizations that suffered or had data stolen through that Move It attack, they weren't necessarily aware that they were contracted with someone using Move It or that third party. So it's really, I think, topical and timely in a conversation. And I think what we'll try to address today is have you really be thinking about how you have these conversations within your own organizations and what you can do to sort of move that forward. I'm going to pause, Nick, just to do a spot check, see if there's any questions that came in.
None yet. You are good to go.
All right. So I tend not to try to look at chat while I'm going through. So from a strategy, we think about, how we're, establishing the program, right? And program versus policy. And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of policy development, but program being, again, sort of that holistic program within your institution. Again, outside of IT, I come from an information security background, being in a role as a chief information security officer, and saw what we used to see as IT risk management or information security risk management morph over the years into enterprise risk management, where both cyber and IT risk were now sort of elevated to the level of enterprise risk. And when we think about vendor and third-party risk management programs, we're seeing that same sort of evolution in that the programs are broader than just sort of IT vendor risk or the information security teams looking at the vendor risk. It has to be sort of holistic to the organization, and we're seeing those map to business continuity programs, to business impact analysis that are tangential to how you're managing third-party risk in your organization. So, thinking about, the program across your organization, not just within IT. Looking at new vendors, right? How are you building the program to reflect an annual review, then as needed review? Is it being driven by media reports, or we know now that publicly traded companies are beholden to reporting material cybersecurity incidents to the SEC, right? And that will become public, and that will help inform us, right, of when we should be doing those reviews of the vendors. Hey, we've just seen a disclosure in an SEC filing. Oh boy, we do business with that vendor. We better go out and take a look and review. So these are all things that we want to consider when we're building that program. And then, we're in an ISAC event, right? So probably auditor heavy. We want to make sure we're doing control alignments. And again, what are the objectives? What are the activities in those controls? Do our controls align with the vendor that we're going to do business with? And then timeframes. We talked a little bit about timeframes around sort of annual, event-driven and such. So we'll dig into a little bit more depth of each of those as we go through the next few minutes. So I was in the military. I didn't talk about my Air Force background. So prior to going into higher ed and a little bit of overlap, I had a 20-year Air Force career. And in that environment, we talk a lot about Sun Tzu and lessons from Sun Tzu. And I sort of have this analogy. If Sun Tzu was in vendor risk today, he'd say, if you know the vendor and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 audits. If you know yourself but not the vendor, for every audit you pass, you'll suffer a failure. And if you know neither the vendor nor yourself, you'll succumb in every audit, right? And I think what's really important to consider there is, as we think about assessing the controls that our vendors are bringing to us, we also need to understand our baselines, right? What are the controls that we have in place, and sort of what is the regulatory environment that we live in? And we think, most of us, from a data security and a privacy, from a regulation standpoint, it could be HIPAA, where business associate agreements are in play. It could be the FFIEC from a financial industry standpoint. It could be, if we're doing business in the UK, they've got, cyber essentials. These are all sort of inherent GRC functions, but it really does come back to, when we think about risk and third-party risk, just making sure that we're understanding and beginning with a baseline of your own organization's controls, right? Are they robust enough for fill in the blank. And as we look at the vendor and we start to assess the risk that this vendor potentially may bring into our organization, we need to understand what our baseline is. Do we have controls that can help mitigate? What do we have in place? What are they bringing in? What do they have in place? And where is that alignment, right? And I think that's, part of the exercise that often falls on IT or information security is to sort of do that alignment and that mapping. And then we also look at, is there an opportunity either through legal or contracting or our procurement offices to give some guidance back to that vendor, asking or requiring or requesting that they mitigate some of those risks before we enter into a contract, right? And that is often easier said than done for especially smaller, medium-sized businesses that may not have the buying power or influence to get a large vendor. We think, Microsoft's, Google's, those type of to do some changes, but we have to make sure that we're thinking about that, especially in the legal and the contracting perspective, right before we've gone into that agreement. It's entered into that agreement. The other thing that we think about is that's important is how we're evaluating, how we're assessing that risk of the vendor, right? And most of us will do that through a standardized questionnaire. And I think the nice part about standards is there's a lot to choose from, right? So we talk about a standardized third-party or vendor risk assessment questionnaire. We have the SIG, we have the CAKE. I came from higher ed where we had the HECVAT, which was the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit. Really great resource, maybe not so great acronym. But again, what we're trying to do here with standardized questionnaires is make sure that all vendors are being assessed with a standardized set of questions and risks that we're trying to address, right? So oftentimes you'll see companies have a bespoke questionnaire. We do this as virtual CISOs for our clients where we're answering multiple questionnaires for third parties, right? So we sort of see both sides of this. And to the extent that we can standardize on the questions we're asking our vendors, as well as a company that is answering questionnaires, right? Or standardizing on the answers that we're providing outbound to potential customers and clients, it levels the playing field so that we're sort of assessing risk from a baseline environment that we're all sort of aware of and we can all learn from. And I'll talk a little bit later. I've got some examples of vendors that are doing this, that are trying to create sort of a good housekeeping seal or an underwriter's laboratory evaluation of a vendor, right? So that we know if they have this seal, they've sort of answered this standard, this baseline questions, right? So those are all really important things to do. And this isn't new. We've been reviewing the security of third parties, we being the industry, for decades, and that universal standard is still in development, right? There's not a standard model like we're familiar with financial services or a credit rating or even our personalized credit score. But that model hasn't fully matured yet to say this is the sort of the score for that vendor. We do see a number, and I'll talk about those in a few slides. A few of those vendors are emerging where they're sort of giving that rating that, while it's not necessarily a standard across the enterprise, across different verticals, it is their version of a standard. And another thing that comes to mind is all of us are probably familiar with going out to dinner, and most of the restaurants now have a sort of a letter grade, right? The health department has come up with a standardized, A through F rating for the cleanliness of a restaurant, and that's there's some vendor risk analogies there. Is I don't know how many of us would want to have a meal at a failing eatery. So something to think about there, and just thinking about the standards that you're using. Are you being consistent in your questionnaires? Are you being consistent in your program of how you're assessing those third parties? So controls, again, I think for this audience, thinking about control objectives and control activities, certainly with an ISACA background, you're all familiar with COBIT and the framework that we use to help design those governing controls. But we want to make sure that we have policies, right? We think about a third party or vendor risk program within our organizations. Policies are going to live there, and that's where the controls are going to be that set the objectives, the parameters that help us evaluate or lay out the risk, and then also define to some degree the activities, those control activities that are going to support those control objectives, right? So we want to make sure that's defined in policy. I have a couple of examples in later slides that we'll talk through. You also want to make sure that your policies and your program are grounded in sort of good sources, right? So we want to make sure that we're mapping to a control framework or to a legal or regulatory environment. It's talked about HIPAA or regulations in the EU around security and privacy. We're starting to see more privacy type questionnaires too, especially around California, CCPA, and sort of morphing sort of third party risk into also not only looking at confidentiality, integrity, availability, the processing integrity, but also sort of the privacy of data that's being shared. So as those questionnaires evolve and mature, we're starting to see more of those privacy questions, and that again maps back to a framework, a legal position, in general best practices, right? And in a perfect world, right, and that's sort of that last bullet, all of these would map into those environments, right? We would make sure that our policy is addressing all of those in a one-for-one. We don't always get there. Sometimes it's an iterative process, but what we're trying to do is design in both an effective policy and language, but also making sure that those controls, you all know this from an audit perspective, are we saying what we're doing, and are we doing the things that we say, and are they measurable? So Nick, take a quick pause there to see if we've got any questions, or
Yes. I have a comment.
Everyone has left the room.
I have a comment and a question. The first one, a comment. This one came in earlier. I sent it to you in message, but I think you were kind of going strong there. So, can we get that modified Sun Tzu quote in writing? I want that on my whiteboard.
Yeah, I will share that, and I make a habit of not sort of looking at chat.
Yeah, that's good.
I get sort of crazily distracted or easily distracted, so I'll make sure you have that, and you can share that out when we
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then the question is regarding the policies. What is the best starting place for policies? Are there any templates or example policies you can share that would help in developing our own vendor management policies? And before you answer that, I just want to remind everyone, feel free to pop your questions in the chat. I will, interrupt Brian whenever, and we'll get those questions in there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have sort of those policy examples coming up. They are linked, but obviously they won't be hyperlinked on the Zoom. But we'll make sure we get those links out so that folks can click through those and see those. So that's a really good sort of segue to sort of the next slide around policies, right? So great setup there. Thank you for that. Whoever put the question in. Really what we're looking at is tone at the top, right? A policy has to align with not only sort of the legal aspects and the legal boundaries for your organization, but also sort of your business objectives, right? And a lot of times we see over the years, specific to cybersecurity, policies were restrictive. Policies were viewed as adding friction in an environment. The policies weren't viewed by the business as an enabler. That was something that was positioning the business to be either more responsive, more nimble, more agile. You throw the buzzwords in there. So we want to make sure that when we think about policies, that we're trying to write policies that are supportive of the business in a way that isn't restrictive, prohibitive, but doesn't introduce risk, unnecessary risk, right, or unvetted risk. And so here, the examples that we have is from the written information security program that Compass works with our clients to provide, and then an example from the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, which some of you may be familiar with. So we'll sort of jump to those, and I think I may have a redundant slide here. Yeah, so this just talks about the examples. The next couple slides is the WISP, the two policies examples, and then I have some vendors that are sort of small business friendly around third-party risk management programs. So we'll talk about both of those in the next couple minutes. So I apologize for the eye chart. Hopefully this is one from a marketing standpoint. I used screenshots, and I didn't go through, Nick, and clean up the the Grammarly or the built-in word. So all those highlights that you guys are all struggling with on looking at this document is where the grammar function within Word wants to put punctuation at the end of each of those little policy statements. So I apologize for that. I'll make sure I clean that up in future. But this is a policy template that we work with our clients. This is an example from Cape Cod Community College, which is one of my current clients, back to the higher ed background that I mentioned earlier. Really sort of having that structure around purpose, scope, and then some policy definitions. And you'll see on that third image is really the reference mapping out to the NIST cybersecurity framework controls in ISO 27001. And really the purpose that you probably can't read on your own screen is you want the policy to describe the information security requirements that are to be followed in the selection and management of third-party services at company X, right? And that the policy also wants to, you want this policy also to define the information security requirements for contracts with those third parties. And again, right, this is part of a written information security program focused on information security aspects of vendor and third party management, right? So this, in my mind, this is a great policy example that supports a larger third party or vendor risk management program at your institution. This is very much the IT and information security specific piece. Depending on the size of your organization, this may be all you have. This is your starting point. This is a great place to begin, but it's very specific to the risk from an information security or IT perspective that the vendors bring in. It's not that holistic business risk, right? So that's where we start to see vendor risk being something. It might be your food service vendors that supply, especially in a higher ed example, if you can't feed the students on campus, that's risk. There might not be an IT risk there. So this is more of an example on the IT side than more of the holistic service provider piece. And that's where this example is the service provider management policy template for the CIS Control 15. So you all may be familiar with the CIS, used to be the top 20, now it's the top 18. And Control 15 is around service provider management. And this is a little bit higher level, more holistic than just sort of the IT perspective, right? And the policy template is meant to help, with those controls and understanding how we're identifying service providers. So I like to use this as an example of great talking points if we're going outside of IT and we're having larger conversations in our organization around identifying our service providers, not just necessarily the service providers that are IT or InfoSec perspective or specific, but what are those enterprise service providers? Establishing the requirements, right? Having conversations, a lot of working with different business units. And that's why I mentioned earlier, we're seeing the mapping to business impact analysis, business continuity programs, right? Is what are those requirements for all of our service providers across the enterprise, including the security obligations, the IT obligations, but performance, availability, shared responsibility, all of those things is helping us as an organization talk about those requirements. And then thinking about how we want to classify those service providers, right? So considering the characteristics, what type of data are they handling? What's the criticality to the organization of that vendor? So this walks us through, right? Assessing the service providers, extending, to their service provider. So understanding, we're assessing their risk, assessing how they assess risk, right? So it seems sort of a little bit counterintuitive, but while we're thinking about the risk they're bringing to us, we also want to get a sense of how do they assess risk of their third parties. And that goes back to that sort of move it example with third and fourth party risks. Talked a little bit earlier about onboarding. That's one of the areas in that flow chart, is making sure that we're thinking about the onboarding process, the monitoring, right? So we brought them in. Talked earlier about sort of monitoring what's going on in the media. How do we know at some regular cadence that we're sort of spot checking or going back and reevaluating? Is it event driven? Is it when something changes? And then at the very end of that, which may be again an eye chart here, but we'll make sure that you guys can click out on that, is sort of decommissioning, right? So things that we think about from user access controls and applications and sort of IT debt, but also service providers, right? How do we remove that, not only them from our processes and access to our systems, but how do we make sure that we're decommissioning the data that's been shared with them? How are we getting that data back? So it's sort of full life cycle. I think this is a great example. You'll see it does get into sort of purpose and responsibility. And I've got only a couple of the first pages here. But format is very similar to what we have in our WISP, right? That's your standard template policy template rather. But again, sort of giving you the process up front, I think that works both in IT and IT security context, but also at a larger, higher level. So that's why I wanted to share that. It's a great resource if you haven't looked at it or used it in the past.
I do have one question for you here, and apologies if you already got to this one, but how often should our vendor management policies be reviewed or updated to remain effective?
So I like to look at from a policy holistically. Policy should be reviewed at least annually. That's what we see for most compliance and regulatory frameworks. We'll say they have to be reviewed annually. That review, there may be no changes required. Everything looks good. You sort of socialize that within your environment. And then it's just annotated on the policy that it was last reviewed on, right? Or if there's updates or changes that need to be, you want to make sure that you reflect in that policy change that it was the last reviewed on and updated on those dates. You also always want to have who was the reviewer so that you have a name and date. And that's something that the auditors will look for. I think at least annually, I think, I always come back to as needed. If there was an event, if you had an incident with a third party at your organization, and as you were sort of going through that incident and that incident response, and you come out of that and you say, what are some of the lessons learned? We should adjust our policy. We should adjust our procedures. That's always a great time to go back and do that. So you don't have to wait sort of for that annual cadence. And that's where I always say sort of event driven is something that's a good trigger for a policy review or a policy update, both whether it's third party risk or just policies in general. And so on the screen, again, these aren't clickable in a Zoom session, but these are three sort of third party risk / GRC vendors that I've worked with that I think again that are recognized as small business friendly. They can scale to larger businesses, but I always look at, again, my background's been higher ed. Many of the clients that I support are smaller clients that don't have tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars for a vendor management program. These are good options. The first, Venseca, is one that's trying to develop or has created what they call a digital trust ecosystem, or a DTE. I mentioned earlier, sort of think Underwriters Laboratory, think Good Housekeeping seal of approval. They're working with the vendors to say, let's have the vendors come through their process and let Venseca do the risk assessments that we would all have to do individually for, say, the same vendor. And then they would become the repository. So we would all go to Venseca to look up vendor X. We would all see the same risk assessment because it was standardized. We would all see that same rating or that digital trust score, and giving us one for those of us that may not have the teams internally to do the risk assessments. And that's one of the things that I saw in my time with EDUCAUSE was I mentioned the HECVAT. Colleges and universities were receiving completed questionnaires. So the HECVAT has a questionnaire. The institution would receive it, but they didn't have the resources internally to understand or vet the answers that the vendor had provided, right? So they were looking for, we'd see colleges that would say, can you look at the answers that were provided and tell us whether we should do business with this vendor or not? And that's hard to say, right? Everybody's risk appetite is different. Talked earlier about have to know what your own controls are to mitigate in place. So it'll be interesting to see how this digital trust ecosystem evolves and is beneficial. I do think there's value in having at least this shared starting point. We know that the vendor has gotten this score. So we'll see how that goes. I encourage you to take a look at it. They are, again, small business friendly. I think they're potentially could be a disruptor in the market. Salty Cloud is one that I worked with in my time in higher ed, but they also service clients outside of higher ed. They are a company, a public benefit company, so not necessarily a nonprofit, but a not-for-profit that's designed to support the public interest. They were created out of the University of Texas at Austin. They have not only sort of a vendor risk management program, but a full GRC suite. That's something to look at. Again, if you're looking for broader governance, risk, and compliance solutions, I recommend taking a look at them as well. And then the last one is Black Kite. They're a New England-based, Boston-based company that provides more than a risk score, right? So they're looking at vendors similar to what Vinseca is doing, and they're trying to, their process endeavors to quantify the risk, right? To give you sort of a dollar amount. What does that risk look like in dollars and cents to your company? They're also looking at the technical risk, right? So what's the solutions that the vendor has in place? What is their technical risk? And then also they have a thing called a ransomware susceptibility index, or an RSI, which gives you sort of a matrix of, is this vendor that you're doing business with susceptible to ransomware? And that goes back to, I think, my first slide where we talked about a lot of the impact that we're seeing in third party and vendor risk is a supplier is impacted by ransomware, and now your company's unable to do business because you don't have access to that third party service provider. So although all three of those are things to look at and consider depending on where you are in your third party risk management program journey. I'd be happy to sort of take questions offline or answer anything specific. We don't resell any of these. We're not a VAR in that respect. These are just companies that I've worked with and that we like to use and recommend for our clients. Nick, anything on questions there?
Sorry, I was muted. Nope, we are
That's
looking
okay.
okay.
I
did
had
get
that
one
panic
comment.
that I'd lost the room, right? I was talking to myself
You
a
have
little
not
bit.
lost the room yet. I did get one comment that one of the audience members is 2 miles away from Cape Cod Community College, so small world.
I wish I was 2 miles away from Cape Cod Community College. But that's okay. Maybe someday. And we talked through timeframes, sort of in wrapping up a couple slides here left. We talked a little bit about timeframes, right? That's always questions that we hear is, when do I do this, right? So when you renew, is it annually? Is it event driven? We've talked about those things. Thinking about amending those contracts, right? So that's, again, engaging your legal team and saying, the threat landscape has changed. What we're seeing in the environment has changed. And while we might have been comfortable with this risk, or we might have been able to mitigate that risk when we initially entered into this contract, things have changed, right? So don't think of these as being static. Similarly, like, is it something that we want to put in our SLAs, right? Do we want to have the right to an independent audit? That's something we're starting to see. Insurance, cyber, we haven't really, we could probably do a whole other webinar on cyber liability insurers, and sometimes they're notifying us now that, hey, we know you do business with company X, and we know that company X has a vulnerability, so tell us how you're mitigating that. So we're starting to see other drivers that sort of dictate some of these timeframes. But I think it's sort of all of these, right? And I think that, remember, the world's changing. Our business is not. That's always debatable, but we have to make sure that we're accounting for what's happening around us, and then sort of level setting that back to, is the business changing? Those are all conversations that aren't always easy for auditors or information security folks or even IT people to have at that business level. But I think that's why this is here, is we've got to map everything back to what we're doing from a third-party risk perspective, is trying to enable the business, trying to reduce business risk. And that's what really drives the timeframes. Next slide is really just resources. I mentioned COVID earlier. NIST as a resource. mapping to frameworks. Affinity groups like ISACA New England, if I was in the room, if we were all together, I would say, do you know each other? Turn to the person to your right or left. Make sure you share contact information. If you're struggling with it, if we were together, you all would benefit more from, as you leave the room, talking to each other and saying, hey, what are you doing? How are you addressing third party risk? What are you doing with vendors? As you might benefit from the time that you've spent with me. So I encourage you to try to do that, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's through, ISAC New England, if we get back to more cadences for face-to-face events. But getting to know each other, reaching out, asking questions, affinity groups are so important to us, both personally and professionally. And then Nick had mentioned earlier, Compass IT, our resources on our website. The next slide is my contact info, my email address, my phone number. I didn't put up my LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. Always happy to talk about anything cyber. So we'll see, Nick, if there's any other questions. I know we're
Yeah,
just about the 40-minute
yeah.
mark. I try not to go a full hour because nobody has that kind of attention span anymore.
I have a couple questions, and while I'm asking these, I encourage the audience to ask any further questions you might have. Let me just grab those here. One question here, our organization often struggles to evaluate the success or effectiveness of our vendor risk management program. What recommendations would you give in that area?
I think it's, asking how others are doing it, right? Because I think a lot of times we struggle because we don't know. We always feel like we're not the best, right? We being sort of whatever organization you're in. So having an understanding of what your program looks like, having a peer network that you can go to and say, again, without driving, business back to Compass, that's something we could do. But I also say just, asking your peers, this is what my program looks like. What does your program look like? How are you doing it? Do you mind, we all have a network of professionals, reaching out and saying, do you mind taking a look and seeing, if there's gaps, right? I think there's so much to benefit from that. But again, there are companies like Compass and others that can come in and evaluate your program against a baseline. I always like to try to say, have those conversations with your peers first. You're not always as bad as you think you are. We always feel like there's so much more to do in our own worlds. Oftentimes we find out that it might be okay. And we're benchmarked with where our others are. I don't know. That was sort of a long-winded answer, but I always say, you don't know until you start asking and getting a sense of what others are doing and like for like.
Definitely makes sense. I have another good one here. Could you provide examples of situations you've encountered where vendor risk management directly impacted a company's operations in a negative or a positive way?
Oof. I mean, the examples are, typically I think that we see more of the horror stories where it was the negative way. I don't know. I think you don't report on when it's been a success, right? So or it doesn't make the news, right? No, it's not newsworthy. There's so many that are the sort of the solar winds, the move its, the log4j, sort of these IT specific third party risks that they were newsworthy and impactful in a negative way. Those are the examples. I think really trying to. It's a great. I didn't bring any case studies for where there was a positive outcome.
Yeah, it's an interesting
It
question.
is. It's a great follow up. Maybe that's a future blog post for us. Nick is writing, the upside. I think that's just in general. It's just culturally, IT security people don't necessarily. We haven't been wired for good news. We've always been wired for bad news.
Yeah, you don't think of all the days your car doesn't break down. You only remember the
Yeah.
ones where it does. Yeah, it's a good question. I have another one here. From someone asking about we have several long-term vendors who are very critical to our operations, and we've struggled with vendor risk management with them. And because of their criticality to our operation, we can't easily drop them. What would you recommend?
I think you still have to evaluate them, and I think knowing, right, that they're critical, that they're sort of irreplaceable, not being able to sort of pull those out of your operations and easily put something in. Again, you've already identified them as being critical. just because they're exclusive and they're critical, and it's a hard conversation, but it has to be that business level where that risk, right, that in and of itself, what you just articulated, is probably the biggest risk, right, is that um, the impact that that vendor's availability to your company is. So I think that it doesn't exclude them from having those annual reviews, or as needed. It doesn't exclude them from filling out the questionnaires and you having um, impactful conversations with them. It may limit, how much force you can put on. I said this earlier when we say, try to move the vendor to mitigate the risk, right? If you can't mitigate it on your side, if you can't manage that risk, what can the vendor do, right? Many of us don't have that leverage. And it sounds like this is an example where you may not have leverage, but you have to have that conversation. You have to be aware of it. I don't think there's an easy answer there. It's a tough spot to be in, but you've got to still understand what that risk, what those risks are and the impact.
And I'd like to thank the audience here because we are keeping you very busy with questions. I got a couple more here, which I guess is always a good sign of a good presentation. Any tips for coordinating the vendor onboarding and risk assessment with other departments? For example, accounting cares about the vendor financial risk, legal, the vendor legal risk, the quality assurance for vendors quality risk.
It's all of that, right? And that goes back to the vendor risk management, a program, not just an IT policy, right? So again, from an IT perspective, going out and having those conversations with accounting, with finance, with procurement, with legal, trying to, if your organization hasn't already matured into that sort of enterprise approach for risk, third-party risk management, that's exactly what you need to do, is have those conversations. Again, that falls maybe more into a larger GRC program or platform, but being able to sort of evaluate or matrix. We think risk register in IT and IT security, but having that full view of risk from financials, company viability, all the way down to IT, and then being able to make informed decisions at a business level of what that risk is what we recommend. And that again is a broad scope, and hopefully your company's moving toward that, because I think that's what we need as cybersecurity and information security professionals, is that risk to be viewed holistically across the company, and not just, well, that's the CIO's problem or that's the CISO's problem.
Very well put. Here is the next and possibly final question, unless anybody else poses one while you're answering this one. As a third-party service provider ourselves, we receive so many third-party risk assessment requests every year from our customers. Challenge is that all of them use different frameworks. Some use SIG, CyberGRX, etc. Any thoughts on how to handle these requests in a more efficient way?
Yeah, I feel that pain. I think the questionnaire side didn't consider the vendors, right? So everybody's got a bespoke questionnaire, right? All of those that you just mentioned. That's what we need. We need a standard, right? Whether that becomes a Venseca seal of approval sort of thing, that's still emerging, right? But I think the bespoke questionnaires don't serve the vendor community, because they're responding to all of those different questionnaires, and the evaluators on the backside aren't, they're not asking the same questions. So I don't have an answer for that. Any of you that know me, I'm not an optimist by birth or training, but we've got to move toward that standard. In my higher ed world, we had settled on that colleges and universities are going to accept the HECVAT. If you're a service provider and you're selling into colleges and universities and you've completed the HECVAT, and college X is asking you to do their own questionnaire, we were encouraging the vendors to push back and say, no, but the higher ed standard is the HECVAT. You should take that. Right? Balancing act. Vendor wants the sale, wants the business. You're not going to lose a prospect because of a questionnaire, but trying to work both sides of that to get to a standard. It takes both sides, right? I think the vendors have to be willing to settle on a standard, and the prospective clients and prospects have to be willing to accept whatever that standard is. We're not there yet. I hopefully, maybe optimistically, try to end this on a high note. Maybe in my professional lifetime, we'll get to that because it's
Uh,
needed.
yeah, I was going to ask you as a follow-up to that. Have you heard any, rumors or about a collectively agreed upon framework for vendors outside of industry-specific questionnaires?
I don't think so. I know that we're starting to see some movement at the federal level from the government around sort of not only software bill of materials, but sort of and I the what they're calling it escapes me right now. CISA has one. I'll look for it and get it, make share it with you so that we can share it with the attendees. That's moving toward that standard. There may be someone on the call that knows it off the top of their mind, but at this point in the hour, my brain is mush. But there is, at some degree, sort of a cyber hygiene aspect, but I do believe it's more focused on consumer technology. So, the baby cameras, baby monitors, those type of things, but maybe we'll get there through it.
I actually have one more for you. If you thought you were getting off easy, that is not going to happen. I was surprised this question hasn't come up yet because this one is asked on pretty much any vendor management presentations we do regarding supply chain vendor issues. How can we mitigate vendor risk like the SolarWinds breach, and what are the key strategies to prevent such incidents in our organization?
That feels like somebody inside our organization asking that. I think you have to go through the process. I'm on the side of there's not a single third party risk management person that would have picked up on SolarWinds, right? If you on paper, what we knew when we were evaluating them looked fine. So I think what you want to keep in your back pocket is the adversary that attacked SolarWinds was a nation state, and if we're trying to defend against a nation state actor infiltrating a third party that we do business with, we don't have those resources. So due diligence, making sure that we're doing our reviews to the best of our ability is all we can do. I don't know that the next SolarWinds is out there. Will we have all probably reviewed their SIGs and their cakes and their CSA documents and their HECVATs and said, yeah, this vendor looks like they're good, and then we find out that they were the next SolarWinds because they were attacked by somebody that skill level was beyond our ability to detect. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, except there's not a good answer for that.